In this morning's story found at the end of the 7th chapter of Mark's Gospel, we witness a healing by Jesus. By this point in the Gospel, we have almost come to expect it. In fact, we might be more inclined to sit up and take notice if Jesus had refused to heal someone. But he didn't. He never refused. He never turned anyone away. And so it wouldn't be unlikely for this morning's story to become lost among the many other miracle accounts found in Mark's Gospel. We might even excuse ourselves if we were given a quiz after reading the Gospel and were asked to name all of the miracles that Jesus had performed. We might excuse ourselves if we accidentally left this one out, this quick 8-verse blurb. It's just not as dramatic as the others, such as the feeding of 5,000 people with just 5 muffins of bread and 2 sardine-sized fish. Or the exorcism of a man who hung out in graveyards, an exorcism that was accomplished by sending a legion of demons into a herd of pigs which went crashing into the sea. And then there were Jesus' nautical miracles, which include the calming of the storm on the sea, as well as his amazing ability to walk on water. We are even witness to the raising of a girl from the dead. And so it's not surprising that as we tick off the miracles on our fingers, that we accidentally skip over this morning's account of the healing of a deaf man. It sounds like so many of the other accounts, but without the flash and pizzazz. But that's typical, isn't it? The deaf community is so overlooked, aren't they? It's hard to pick out a deaf person in a crowd. They don't need a wheelchair to get around. They aren't gently touching the elbow of someone who guides them past any obstacles. They simply blend into the crowd until you try to speak to them. That's when you discover you speak 2 different languages. But in this morning's account of Jesus' encounter with a deaf man, he seems to slide right past the language barrier that stood between him and the deaf man. First of all, Jesus took the man away from the crowd, knowing the man could concentrate better. Jesus knew it's hard to concentrate when lots of things are happening around. He took the man to a private place. He wanted to focus on the deaf man alone. He knew that deaf people don't like hearing people staring at them. Jesus was truly deaf aware. And next, Jesus looked upward. It may have been a gesture of looking heavenward for a response to his prayer, but it also may have been so the man could see easy for lip reading with no shadows on his face from the bright sun. Jesus said one word, which means open. He didn't preach to the man, just one word, easy to lip read. You can imagine the clear way Jesus spoke. And finally, Jesus used sign language. Jesus touched the man's ears and touched his tongue. I don't think the gestures were part of a healing ritual. He didn't need gestures or rituals to heal. He could have done it without even touching the man at all. I believe Jesus was asking the man in sign language if he wanted to hear and speak. And he was showing him in sign language and gesture that he knew what the man wanted, and Jesus showed the parts of the body that he was going to heal. Would to God that we were as sensitive and compassionate to the needs of our deaf sisters and brothers as was Jesus. Have you ever considered what it's like to be a deaf person in Waco? For a deaf person to go to museums like the Mayborn Museum Complex, the deaf can't fully appreciate the exhibits because much of the information is in the accompanying audio. And going to the movies. The Waco movie theaters don't offer showtimes with closed captioning, making it impossible for a deaf person to go to a movie with family or friends or understand it. And the elevators. Yes, elevators. The concern that an elevator could break down becomes a real issue for a deaf person who can't communicate there's a problem without the proper technology. Or can you imagine what it's like for a deaf person who needs to go to the emergency room? The stress of having to take a trip to the emergency room, which is great in and of itself, is only amplified when it's difficult to communicate. The inability to describe symptoms or ask questions increases the likelihood for miscommunication. It's tough enough being a deaf person in Waco, but can you imagine what it's like to be a deaf person in the LGBT community of Waco looking for a place to worship authentically? Think about it. Our gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender deaf community is simply out of luck when it comes to churches, including our own. Early on in my ministry at this church, I remember meeting a couple who took their position in what I have come to mentally designate as the newcomers pew at the back of the sanctuary. Before church, I went over to introduce myself to them. That's when I discovered one of them was deaf. And I realized how glaringly deficient our worship service was for this young man. After worship, I rushed over to them before they could make their escape, and I handed over my sermon manuscript in a feeble hope that it was some sort of consolation. They returned once or twice, but no more than that. Through email, the deaf man told me that we really needed to get an interpreter. And he's right. It's time for a change. I agreed with him, but soon forgot about the priority as I became faced with the things that all church pastors concern themselves with: finances, attendance, building maintenance. I forgot about him for a while, but my conscience was nudged every time I would see a person out in our community speaking to another with their hands instead of sound. I was heartened to hear that some of our own people are interested in learning some songs in sign language. It's a good beginning, but it's only a beginning. Some of us feel that because we are a church that affirms the LGBT population as beautiful expressions of God's love, we can describe ourselves as a church that's open and accessible to everyone. But we have a way to go before that's really true. Last week I talked about how accessibility goes beyond an affirmation of one's sexuality. We aren't truly accessible unless we are physically accessible to people with mobility challenges. And if we reflect for any length of time upon this morning's passage, I think we will come to the understanding that we aren't truly accessible unless we are accessible to the deaf community either. We haven't received any more visits from the young man who came a couple times so many years ago. Maybe he moved away, or maybe he simply gave up on us. I hate to think that might be the case, but I wouldn't blame him if he had. It's time for a change, but I can't do it alone. In fact, I'm not sure that I can do it at all, but you can. You can decide what we are going to do. Are we going to truly become a house of prayer for all peoples, or are we going to talk about it? Are you willing to invest the time, effort, and finances in reaching out to the deaf community or not? I think we've got something here that's worth sharing with others. But there's an entire community of people in Waco that are unable to receive it because it simply hasn't been made available to them yet. Last week I closed my sermon by saying that when the word is spoken in every language and through every deed, then a healing occurs. I hope you realize that languages are not necessarily limited to spoken languages. ASL is as much a language as is English or Spanish or Portuguese. I think it's time for a change. It just may be time to learn a new language. What do you think? Amen.